Yeah,
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today to the Robert W. Marvel Theater of the Michael C. Rockefeller Art Center at the State University of New York at Fredonia. That's a mouthful. Today, we think those middle initials are important. This is a continuation of our celebration of the center's 50th anniversary season. We have some events that have happened and some that are coming up, and hopefully you have our calendar of events with all that information. The center you're in today is one of 4 I.M. Pei firm of architects designed building on this campus. It was the last of them to open in 1969. And when it did, the then governor of the state of New York, Nelson C. Rockefeller, came to this campus by helicopter for the dedication ceremony for this and the other signature I.M. Pei buildings, including Reed Library, the campus center now known as the Williams Center, and Robert Needham Hall. The building is named after Governor Nelson Rockefeller's son, Michael Clark Rockefeller, who died in 1961, or disappeared, I should say, in 1961. There were rumors for years that he was still alive in some remote island, and our talk today is about what actually happened. I want you to know that there is absolutely no Rockefeller Family Foundation money behind this operation or this center, and none from any of the Rockefeller foundations. And if there are any new administrators in the audience tonight who think that's a good idea to approach them, we should have a private talk afterwards. I always spend time dissuading new administrators from that avenue of fundraising. The trustees of the State University system thought it would be nice to do something to honor Nelson Rockefeller and his family, not only for what they had done for the state of New York, but particularly for the State University of New York system, which Governor Rockefeller had been a primary architect of. And he was what we call a tax and spend Republican, and he liked big money and he liked building things. And many of the SUNY campuses benefited from his vision during the 1970s, and we are one of those campuses, including especially the 4 I.M. Pei buildings. They thought it would be nice to honor the family, but SUNY had a rule at that time that you cannot name a building after a living person, so they chose Michael Clark Rockefeller, the governor's son, to be the namesake for this building. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Daniel A. Reed Library and the Department of Sociocultural and Justice Sciences, and especially the Carnahan-Jackson Fund of the Fredonia College Foundation for supporting and funding today's speaker. And I'd like everyone to know that there is a reception and book signing immediately after the Q&A, which will follow Mr. Hoffman's talk, and that will take place in the Lakeshore Savings Atrium lobby. You go out the doors you came into the theater here and down the red carpeted stairs to your left to get there. You're all invited. Our speaker today is a former contributing editor to the National Geographic Traveler and Wired magazines, and has traveled on assignment to over 80 countries. He's also the author of 4 books. The Lunatic Express, Discovering the World via its Most Dangerous Buses, Boats, Trains, and Planes, was named one of the 10 best books of 2010 by the Wall Street Journal. Savage Harvest, upon which today's talk is based, was a Washington Post notable book of 2014, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and a New York Times bestseller, and has been translated into 9 languages. His more recent book, The Last Wild Men of Borneo, was an Amazon Best Book of 2018, a finalist in the Banff Mountain Book Competition, and was long listed for the Edgar Prize, and Washington Post called it a work of remarkable empathy. He is now working on a new book about journeying deep inside President Trump's rallies, seeking to understand the strange and powerful tribe that forms the president's base. It will be published in September of 2020. Will you join me in welcoming our speaker today, Carl Hoffman.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Jefferson. When this facility opened in 1969, no one knew what had happened to the man it was named for, Michael Clark Rockefeller. He had suddenly vanished, presumably drowned just a few years earlier in 1961. And I'm here to tell you what happened. It's a story about power, ultimately, and about an encounter between a man who was from one of the most powerful and richest families on earth and a group of men who were illiterate and penniless and naked and probably the least powerful people on earth. But it's really, it's much more complex story than just that. Just to refresh your geographical knowledge, for those of you, New Guinea, the word New Guinea refers to the island as a whole, which is divided into two countries. On the eastern side is the country of Papua New Guinea, formerly an Australian, for the most part, Australian colony. And on the west, what is now known as West Papua, part of the country of Indonesia. And in 1961, when our story takes place, it was known as Netherlands New Guinea. It was a Dutch colony. And it is, we actually wanted to show you another pointer, but right, if you see down the bottom, Emanpanpare, that's sort of right in here is Asmat. And it's just a 10,000 square mile swamp, roadless swamp. It's a land of rivers and mud. There are no rocks there, no hills, just trees, rivers, ocean. On one side is the Arafura Sea, and there are huge tides. The sea rolls in and for miles and creates this kind of netherworld that's not quite land and not quite sea. And on the other side are 16,000-foot mountains. It's a very isolated area. And it is home to the Asmat. And even today, there are no roads. There is one cell tower in the main city of Agats. Many of the villages have no stores, no plumbing, no electricity. And the Asmat are incredibly complex, smart, interesting people, and they were headhunters, among other things. This is an Asmat skull. And they were fantastic artists. This is what's known as a mask, even though it's really a full body mask. And they carved beautiful instruments out of wood, drums and spears and paddles. But the most significant thing that they did was carve these poles known as beach poles. These are, the picture's a little bit distorted, it's kind of squished, but these are the beach poles that Michael Rockefeller collected. They are in the Michael C. Rockefeller Room in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. They are about 23, 24 feet high. And they are, each pole, they're columns of stacked ancestors. And each pole embodies the soul of a man who has recently deceased. And each pole is a commitment to revenge. We would say revenge, really to reciprocate. The Asmat lived in a world of extreme balance. Everything had to be in balance all the time. It was a promise to reciprocate the death. And only then, only when that death was reciprocated, was the deceased soul free to move on to the land of Safan, the land beyond the sea. And if that didn't happen, that soul would hang around the village and do lots of bad things, make people sick and make them die. And so throughout everything I tell you, the most important thing for you to remember is this idea that unless that reciprocation happened, things were powerfully awry in the village. And in 1957, two things happened, and they're remarkable, really, that they happened in the same year, just a couple months in between each other. And first, there were two villages, Omadasep and Ochinep, two Asmat villages about 5 miles apart as the crow flies, a bit further in rivers. And they were both big, powerful, very traditional villages, and they had been fighting each other for years. Omadasep would kill some people from Ochinep. Ochinep people would kill some people from Omadasep. They were enemies, but they were also connected in ways that, in complex ways, often by marriage and kinship. And there was a man, and what's really remarkable is that there's a man named Phaniptus, a powerful warrior, and he actually carved one of these poles. And one day he convinced some men in Omadasep to go to Ochinep and convince some men from Ochinep to go on a voyage down the coast with them. And they had this, they convinced the men, there was a pool, a magic pool on a place called the Dougal River. And in that pool, if you threw heads into the pool, dog's teeth would be produced. And you'll see necklaces of, dog's teeth were very important, and they were a form of money. And for instance, a man who was wanting to purchase a wife would have to have dog's teeth necklaces. So they convinced the men from Ochinep to go on this voyage, but it was all a ruse because, of course, they needed heads to throw into the pool, and I'm not really sure why the men from Ochinep accepted this crazy voyage, but they did, and madness broke out, massacres happened, and of 124 men that went out, only 11 returned alive. And it was kind of one of the last great battles in Asmat. And at the same time, that same year, Nelson Rockefeller opened the Museum of Primitive Art in Manhattan. And it's not a great picture, but the museum was, and Michael was actually only 19 at the time, and he was made a board member. And what was significant about the museum, it was the first museum dedicated wholly to primitive art in America, so-called primitive art. We don't call it that now. And what was particularly significant about it was that until this time, what we think of as tribal art was usually shown in museums in an ethnological setting. You know the famous dioramas when you were a kid. You know, the Eskimos sitting around the ice hole with a seal, and it was all kind of taxidermied. And that's the way ethnographic art had always been shown, so-called ethnographic art. But Nelson suddenly took it and put it on removed it from the context and put it on white plinths, and suddenly the idea was that the greatest tribal art was as good as anything by a Western master, you know, a Picasso or a Da Vinci. And that was seen as very progressive at the time, but it was also actually fairly flawed in a way, because unlike Western art, all of Asmat, or certainly modern Western art, all of Asmat art was sacred art. And all of Asmat art was filled with the souls of men and women. And a shield, for instance, was covered with complex designs, and those designs could make a man fall to his knees in fear just by seeing them. So Nelson, in 1957, he opened the Museum of Primitive Art. The same within months of this last great massacre. In 1961, Michael graduated from Harvard and signed on to a film project that went into the highlands of New Guinea, not Asmat. And he was the sound man, and while he was there, he heard about the Asmat and their incredible art, and he made a reconnaissance journey to Asmat to check it out, and he couldn't believe what he saw, the beach poles and everything, and he wanted to go on a longer collecting mission for his father's museum. And when the filming was over, he went. And as he traveled, the longer he spent, the more comfortable he felt, and he went from a clean-cut young college man to a bearded explorer. And one day he was with a 34-year-old Dutch anthropologist named Rene Wassing, who had been given to him sort of as his minder by the Dutch government, and they were with two young teenage Asmat boys, sort of the so-called boat boys. And they were just crossing the mouth of a river on a kind of a pontoon boat, two dugout canoes lashed together, and the engine died and it was swamped, and the wave flipped them over, and they all climbed on the upside down boat, and the two Asmat boys, they pretty much immediately swam off to get help, and Michael and Rene couldn't really see whether they reached shore or not. And nobody came to rescue them. They floated 24 hours, and the next day, Michael said to Rene that I think I can make it. I'm going to swim for shore. They could still see shore. And Michael strapped two empty 5-gallon gasoline tanks to his body, tied them on with rope, and he said, I think I can make it, and he swam away. Rene was older, 34. He had a little more sense, and of course, what's the first law of yachting? Never leave the boat. So Rene stayed behind, and late that afternoon, early evening, he was spotted by a Dutch patrol aircraft, and then the following day he was rescued, and Michael was never seen again. Immediately, Nelson, the governor, and Michael's twin sister Mary flew to New Guinea, flew to Asmat, and there was a massive search. Dutch patrol planes, helicopters were brought in from Australia, masses of missionaries on the ground, on all, every available possibility. And this is kind of a remarkable picture that I want you to remember. In particular, there's the governor in his whites in the middle, and Mary. But the man, the young blonde man with the insignia on his epaulets, I want you to remember. He was a Dutch colonial patrol officer, and he was assigned to escort Nelson and Mary. But after 2 weeks looking, not a trace of him was found. And after 2 weeks, all the assets, all the search and rescue assets left. The governor left, and Mary left, and everybody went home. And I'm actually going to... that was in November of 1961. In March of 1962, a report hit the Associated Press. A Dutch priest in Asmat, had written home to his parents and said that the missionaries here have heard a story that Michael actually made it to shore and encountered some men from the village of Ochinep, and he had been killed and consumed. And the parents let the cat out of the bag, and it hit the AP wires. And this is actually in Dutch, but in the part on the right, says Rockefeller eaten. And instantly, of course, the Rockefeller family heard about this and contacted the Dutch embassy in Washington, D.C. and said, we've heard, what's going on? And this cable came back. And the significance of this cable is on the bottom left, it's Luns. It was signed by Joseph Luns, who was the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs. And it says that we've heard these rumors too, and we've investigated fully. We've done this whole complete investigation, and there is no credibility to these rumors. Michael did not make it to shore. He was not killed. And that's where the story lay for many years. In 2012, I started working on the book. I had this idea that maybe it was enough time had passed, and that with a substantive effort and a systematic effort, I might be able to find something new. And I hired a researcher in the Netherlands to go into the archives of not only the Dutch government, but the Catholic Church. And we started finding very, very quickly amazing things, documents that no one had ever seen before. And among those documents was were two reports from two missionaries. One, Father Van Kessel, Cornelius Van Kessel, another Father Van Pai. And they had been living in Asmat for a number of years. They spoke the local Asmat language. They were known by the tribes, by the Asmat people. And they, after the planes and helicopters had gone home, they had started making their rounds and immediately started hearing these rumors that Michael had made it to shore and he'd been killed by the men of Ochinep. And they investigated, and Van Kessel wrote a very detailed, long and detailed report, and it was so detailed that it named names. It named who had Michael's head, and it named who had his femur, his tibia, certain ribs. And then there was a similar report from Van Pai. Well, when I started looking, unfortunately Van Kessel had died, but I found Van Pai alive. Oh, here's Van Kessel, and he was an unusual man. He was very comfortable in Asmat, and he loved the Asmat, and they liked him, and he sort of dressed up like one. But it was Van Pai who I discovered alive.
If it's true that he has been killed at that time, you must tell me where is his head. And then they said, Vincem Otepetsara, and I right away understood because I know the language. Vincem Otepetsara, die hangt in het huis van Vin, de kop. The head, the skull, hangs in the house of Finn. Finn is his own name, eh? Mm-hmm.
So that was pretty incredible. And then I found this man. Remember the young blonde patrol officer with Nelson and Mary? This is Wim van der Waal. Many years later, I found him living in the Canary Islands, Spain. And he had quite a tale to tell. He, it turned out, it was his boat that Michael Rockefeller was using. He'd sold that boat to Michael. Van der Waal he too loved being an Asmat, and he traveled. He had this boat commissioned, and he traveled all up the rivers and swamps of Asmat, and he had a gun that he'd been issued, which he never brought with him, and he felt very relaxed among the Asmat. But not all, and then he was tasked with escorting Mary and Nelson, but most important of all, after that cable from Joseph Luns saying that a full investigation had taken place, there had been no investigation. After that, the government dispatched Van der Waal to do an investigation. And he went to Ochinep and he lived in the village, and he decided that Michael had in fact been killed. And I started to amass all of these documents, and crazy documents from the apostolic vicar, who was the highest Catholic Church official in New Guinea at the time, that says to Van Pai and Van Kessel, do not mention this to anyone. This is like a cabinet of glass. And all sorts of crazy stuff. And then I found the reports of this man, whose name was Max Lepre. And Lepre was kind of the mirror image of Wim van der Waal. He was his family had been in the Dutch colony, in the Dutch East Indies for 300 years, and he was racist, and he was extremely uncomfortable among the Asmat. And he, in 1957, after the battle between Ochinep and Omadisep, he had decided it was time to dissuade them from further violence and teach them a lesson and teach them the power of the Dutch government, his own words in his own report. And of course, the best way to do that is, with weapons. And he went in, he burned the longhouses of Omadisep, and then he went to Ochinep and opened fire, and he killed 5 people. And imagine those people who had been killed. They needed their souls were out there wandering around in the village, and there was no reciprocation possible. So I had all of that. I had this whole kind of outline of what had theoretically happened to Michael Rockefeller, but it was all these 50-year-old Dutch archival material, and I felt like I needed to go to Asmat myself and see what was what. So this is Agats, the big city, and then this is my first hotel. And then I found these men. The man in yellow is named Willem, and he had a boat. And remember, there are no roads there. And then the guy in the foreground in the white shirt, his name is Amatis, and he spoke English. And I didn't tell them anything about Michael Rockefeller. I just said that I was a writer from America, and that I was interested in Asmat history and culture, and that I wanted to go to different villages, and I wanted to end up in the villages of Omadisep and Ochinep. And they said, great. And off we went. Rivers, and smaller rivers. And we ended up in a village called Basim. And in Basim, there's no hotels or anything, so you just stay wherever. And often you stay if there's a school, you stay in the principal of the school's house, because he's kind of the big man. And we were just sitting on the floor, and this man walked in. His name was Kokai, and Amatis got very deferential to him and called him Papa, father, and said he was the Kapaladesa, the head man of the village of Pirien, which is actually Ochinep. Ochinep had split into 2 villages, Ochinep and Pirien, but basically for our purposes the same village. And he said, he's got a new wife, and that's why he's in Basim. And I said, well, how old is he? And he said, well, he doesn't know how old he is, but maybe 60, in his early 60s. And I said, well, suddenly I thought, wow, he was alive maybe when some of these events took place. So I started asking him about Lepre's raid. And I didn't speak any Indonesian or Asmat at that time. And the Asmat are these incredible storytellers, and they gesticulate widely. And Kokai started telling me the story, and he's pulling arrows, and I don't understand any of it. But then suddenly I hear these names that I recognize, 5 names, and I can't believe it. They're the names that are in the reports that are of the men who were killed by Max Lepre. And that moment, I got goosebumps. Suddenly, for the very first time, these 50-year-old archival documents met, the real memories of men in the place that it had happened. And that's when I suddenly knew that I thought I was onto something for real. And then we proceeded to Omadisep. And they were in the middle of a ceremony, which I got to hang out for, and I asked them about the voyage to the Dougal River and the battle that happened, and Max Lepre's raid, and then I ended up finally in Ochinep. And remember, I still hadn't told Amatis anything about Michael Rockefeller. And Amatis was and Ochinep was a different place altogether. The vibe there felt completely different. It had been known as this very, very traditional village. And Amatis gathered the men together, and this is an amazing picture for me to look at now. At the time, I didn't know who any of these men were. And everybody gathered around, and I was asking them again about these events, the Lepre raid, and about the battle. And they would tell me a little bit, but not very much. They were pretty reticent. And I think we had just gone, we had been out for a couple weeks of traveling, and we had to leave. So I went back to Agats, the main town, and I realized I needed to go back, and I went back in. This time I flew in another because Amatis English was not so great, so I flew in a translator to help me with my translator. And we went back to the village. We stayed 4 days, and I got nowhere. That time it was even worse. People didn't want to talk to me at all. And one day Amatis said, well, they're afraid. And I said, what are they afraid of? He said, well, there's this American who came to the village and he died. And I was like, oh, really? He said, American tourist. And I said, oh, really? Like, I hadn't heard stories about any American tourist. And I said, what was his, who was he? What was his name? And he said a name that didn't make any sense to me. I didn't recognize. And after 4 or 5 times, I realized he was saying Michael Rockefeller. And I was like, oh, Michael Rockefeller. And then I confessed to Amatis that's why I was really there. And I was trying to find out about Michael Rockefeller. He said, well, they're afraid that you're going to ask him about Michael Rockefeller, because all the things that you're asking about are related to the Michael Rockefeller case. And by the end of my 4 days, I couldn't even get men to come to talk to me at all. I was getting the cold. Well, put it this way, I'll show you this slide. This shows you my incredible, when I left the village after 4 days, the warm send-off that I got. So I left, and that was, all of that took around 2 months. I had a 2-month visa, and I was running out of time and money and energy. And I'd gotten a lot. I'd seen Asmat, and I had all this archival stuff, and I had, Kokai and other people telling me the stories of a basic outline of the story of Max Lepre and everything. So I went home, and I started trying to work on my book and write. And I wrote for several months, and then one day I put my proverbial pen down, I closed my laptop, and I realized everything I was doing was wrong, and that I didn't understand Asmat at all, and that I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't understand this culture, and I didn't really know it. They hadn't told me anything about Michael Rockefeller, and that I had committed, the cardinal sin of journalism, which was just parachuting in, and that I hadn't spent enough time and made enough effort, and I had been into the village. Amatis had an assistant, and Willem, the boat guy, had an assistant, and they brought a cook, and then I had the translator for Amatis, and the second time I was there were eight of us plus me. This whole entourage, and everything was done through Amatis or the translator. I wasn't speaking directly to anyone. And I decided that I needed to flip things around, and I needed to go back to the village, and that I needed to go not for 1 day, not for 4 days, but I needed to go live in the village. And that I needed to speak to people directly by myself. I needed to go live there by myself. So I found a woman I live in Washington, D.C., an Indonesian woman who could teach me Bahasa Indonesia. There's no way I'd ever learn Asmat. And started intensive, private lessons with her. And after a couple months, 7 months after I had left, I went back to Asmat. And it's kind of a long story, but I ended up moving to Ochinep and living with Kokai in his house. And there were about 20 people living in this house. And there were about 50 houses in the village, and 9 of them were wooden. All the rest were just native materials, and the Indonesian government had built those houses, and Kokai had been the Kepala Desa, the sort of elected mayor, actually, as it turned out, and so he'd gotten one of those houses, and there were windows but no glass, there's no furniture, you'll see all that. Moving there, everything changed. It was a completely different experience. And instead of being this guy who just kind of dropped in asking all these questions, I lived with them, and I was living with Kokai, who was a respected elder, and I was speaking Indonesian very badly, and but learning more all the time. And I was, instead of being with a retinue, I was by myself, and I had handed myself over to the care of people. And I just, not only that, but I didn't ask any questions. I just lived with them. I didn't ask any questions at all about Michael Rockefeller. And Kokai knew everything, and he knew stories and songs, and he would sing for me. Oh, and this is his third wife and his seventh child. And he dressed up traditional clothes one day for me. Tried to get me to dress up too. My septum wasn't pierced. And he sang these incredible songs. Believe it or not, that's a love song. And this is from Kokai's front porch. And it was really hard to live there at first, but as days went by, I kind of fell into the rhythm of the village, and its beauty slowly kind of crept into me. This is at dawn, and those are all women. The women, of course, do all the work, all the fishing, harvest all the wood, take care of the kids, everything. The men just sit around. And the smoke is from coal. They don't have matches, so you always need a coal burning. And that's just on a little bed of mud. And this was a typical meal. There's not a ton of food there, which gets into whole other issues. These are very tiny shrimp that the women catch, and they bind them in a sago palm leaf and put them on the fire, and they taste kind of like ammonia. And then the two things on the bottom are sago. That's Asmat's principal nutritional source, and it's just the processed. They harvest the pith of a sago palm, and they process it with water and make a kind of a powder out of it that they shape in balls, and they stuff into palm leaves and just stick on the fire. And it tastes kind of, when it's really fresh, it's sort of warm and nutty, but really it's basically like eating cardboard. They eat a huge amount of it. For me, it's hard to eat that much. And then these are the larvae of the sago, the Capricorn beetle, which are a key source of nutrition and a ceremonial sacred food, often equated with the human brain. And they're kind of delicious if you can get by the fact you're eating a worm. They taste like, everything. There's no fat in Asmat. We don't realize, even in our low-fat, best diets, we don't realize really how much oil and fat we have available to us. In a place like Asmat, when you've got nothing but little shrimp and little crabs and little fish and sago, a little fat goes a long way. And the worms are like bursts of sort of bacon pistachios in your mouth. And I was really lucky while I was there. The men decided to build a new Jew, J-E-U, and they built this. This is a traditional Asmat longhouse, about 300 feet long, and they built it. The only tools they had were machetes. There's not a nail in that thing, not a blueprint, nothing. They just talked, and they all knew how to do it. And they were starting to celebrate and drum and sing as a part of the process of building that structure, which is a sacred structure. And when they finished, it was a big party. When they put the roof on, everybody came out. These are all women. Well, most of them. the men got dressed up too. And there was this constant kind of celebrating going on. And this is a man named Bear who's a pretty important guy in the village. His father was done by, his father was involved in the killing of Michael Rockefeller and all the theatrics that went along with it. And at a certain point, slowly, just living in this world and talking to, every morning I'd get up and just drink coffee, which I had brought, and cans of condensed milk. I just didn't want to be without my coffee. I would drink my coffee, we'd wake up at dawn, and the asthma, there's no furniture, there's no beds or anything, there's no electricity, no store in the village, no power. So everybody, sometimes people go to sleep at dusk, and sometimes they stay up talking till 11 p.m. And then when they fall asleep, they just kind of fall over and go to sleep. I mean, people just sleep where they are, essentially. And then about 4:30, the babies start crying and screaming, and the parents are like, "Be quiet, it's too early." And then around 5:30, everyone's up, and I would just sit and drink my coffee and smoke. You got to smoke. Asthma are crazy smokers. I'm not a smoker, but I would smoke with them and talk about life and lore, but asking nothing about Michael Rockefeller. And one day, after several weeks, I asked Kokai if he was interested in seeing some old photos. And Michael had taken lots and lots of photos, and he was quite a talented photographer. And all those photos are in the archives of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I had mimeographed or Xerox photocopied a lot of them. And I had this idea, I wanted to see if Michael had photographed the people who had killed him. And that's important culturally because the Asmat preferred to kill someone that they knew, whose name they knew, because they would take the name, and that's all part of headhunting and cannibalism, in that you become the other. So were I to kill Jefferson, I would eat Jefferson, or parts of him anyway, and then I would take the name of Jefferson. And Jefferson's parents would call me Jefferson. And so I whipped, and Kokai said, he'd love to see him. So I took them out, and instantly, people just appeared out of nowhere and swamped us to look at the picture. And there are no photographs. Nobody has any photographs in Asmat. So these were all their relatives, and they knew everyone. They knew the name of everyone in the photos. And they were seeing pictures of their parents and their aunts and uncles and grandparents for the first time in years since they had died. They were really, it was a kind of a moving, not kind of, it was a very moving moment. And about half the people identified in the original reports as having participated in the killing of Michael Rockefeller were in these photos. So in that crazy, eerie strangeness, Michael had photographed the people who would later kill him. And this is the man named Top Pep. His father's name was Pep, and it's alleged that Pep is the one who actually drove the spear into Michael. And this is in the new longhouse, the new men's house, just hanging around. And there are your dog's teeth necklaces, adornments. This guy was, and his father had been, he was the head of the Jew, and his father had been involved in, had been alive and had been an important person at the time of Michael Rockefeller's death. And so toward the end of my month there, I started finally asking questions, but they were a very different kind of questions. I didn't say, who's Michael Rockefeller, what happened to him, why was he killed? I didn't ask about him at all. I asked, who were the men who had been killed by Max Lepre, and what were their positions, their roles in the village? And it turned out that there were 5 Jews, 5 longhouses. Each one is like a clan. So the word refers not just to the structure, but almost to the parish, as you will, to the clan as a whole. And the Kapala Parang is like the Kapala Adat, the most important, ceremonially sacred, most important person in the clan. Lepre had killed 4 out of the 5 heads of the Jews, the very most important people in the village. And then I asked who were the people who had were named in the reports as having participated in the killing of Michael Rockefeller, and all of those people were directly related by blood and marriage to the men who had been killed by Max Lepre, and all of them, and some of them had become the new Kapala Parangs, Kapala Adats, the new leaders of the Jew. And those men carried a sacred obligation to reciprocate Michael's murder. And other things that I don't have the time to share with you, but it became very, very clear to me, without a doubt, that Michael had been killed. And all of everything that was in the documents lined up with everything that the Asmat in the village of Ochinep were telling me. And it was an incredible privilege to hang out with them. And one day they drummed and sang for 24 hours straight. And after a month, it was time for me to go. And suddenly I felt a little bit sad about leaving, and we posed for a picture with Kokai and the family. Those were all the people that lived in the tiny house. At first, people kind of dispersed, but after a couple of weeks, they started returning. And we all kind of hung out together. And I felt that I had figured it out, and that I understood what had happened to Michael Rockefeller. And that's the story. It's a bit more complicated than that in the book, but I urge you to read it. And I'd love to take any questions.